Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. I really enjoyed meeting Richard Boyatzis. Now that I've read his work and heard of him for really decades, there at Case Western University, where he is highly recognized and a distinguished university professor, and you'll hear all of his other titles in a moment. I thought, whoa, this is, what am I going to do here? He certainly outranks me. By the end of this conversation, I feel like he's my friend, and I hope he feels the same way. He just puts you at ease and brings you into his story and shows interest in one's responses, mine now in particular. And I think that you're hearing a very smart teacher who is a gifted researcher and writer and thinker. All on my watch. Here is Richard Boyatzis. Folks, I have demonstrated over the many episodes of this podcast that I love networking. I love people whose networks lead me to other people in other networks. And eventually I found Richard Boyatzis in one of those webs. Richard, I'm not sure where I trapped you.
It wasn't the dark web, that we know.
But it was a light web. It was a happy web.
Right.
But it is a way that a study of practice works, because it's such a big word and such a big question that I will probably be looking to meet wonderful people like Richard for at least my next 10 years, which would make me 90. After that, Richard, I might taper off on the podcasting, right. But it's great. And I would love to introduce Richard with all of his practice as titles, but I have a very difficult time with my short-term memory. So Richard, introduce all those great titles, starting with the distinguished professor, because I think that was terrific.
Thank you, Dave. I'm a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve University. I'm also a professor in the departments of organizational behavior and psychology and cognitive science. And I have an endowed chair, the H. Clark Ford Professorship. And mostly I do my research in, well, it's indicated by the fact that I publish in about 7 different fields, from medicine and dentistry, psychology, education, management, all that. My main position is based in the School of Management, and I teach leadership and emotional intelligence and coaching. And my main research interest since 1967, when I left the aeronautics and astronautics field and designing interplanetary vehicles to get into psychology, has been intentional change theory, or a variation of that basic theory. And a lot around coaching. And in the past 15 years, I've done a certain amount of that, not just behavioral research and longitudinal, but also neuroimaging studies. So I've become a neuroscientist as well.
Boring. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, right.
Unbelievable. No, and 7
keeps
different,
me busy.
It's different fields and all of those things. What I heard at the end was what might be the silver thread that's run through all these years then, not just the aeronautical aspect of, but that notion of change.
Yeah, I mean, I was, since the time I was 9, I wanted to be in the space program. And despite the 3 times at PS 150 in Queens, they tried to leave me back because they thought I was cognitively slow for all sorts of reasons.
Did they mess up on that one?
And well, including that in 1949 and 50, if you I spoke with a Greek accent, even though I was born in Brooklyn, but and I could read Greek letters, but I couldn't read English letters. And in those days, that was coded as a cognitive retardation, not multiculturalism. But at any rate, So Sputnik went up, I got tested, and it turns out I was really good in math and physics. So I was in this, by then we had moved out to Nassau County, Long Island. I was in a working class community. They had this phenomenal public school system, absolutely phenomenal, because it had a lot of money from an Air Force base and a county jail and county hospital and all sorts of stuff. But I ended up getting 2 years of college while I was in high school. And it was the beginning of what we now know as the AP program.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get into the space program, and I got into my first choice, MIT, and was doing I majored in control systems of interplanetary vehicles, but I ran out of money. I mean, my father was a waiter. My parents had immigrated to the U.S. and MIT got me a job doing research in the Experimental Dynamics Research Lab at Northrop in L.A. And that was in 1966. And what I learned, and they gave us a job for about 6 months, and it was a full-fledged job. And if you saved your money, along with some scholarships and all that, you'd have enough to finish, which is exactly what happened. But in the process, what I learned was I didn't like actually doing the work. It was boring. And I got back to MIT, and I'm much too compulsive not to finish. So in fact, I finished my aero and astro. So I only had 2 technical. But I said, I don't want to do this, even though they'd offered us jobs. And 2 of my fraternity brothers that had been out there with me, in fact, did get job offers and did go into the field, although not for Northrop. I didn't want to go to the restaurant business, which every Greek male I knew, every family member, all of my parents' friends on this side of the Atlantic were in the restaurant business in New York. And although I put myself partially through MIT with my music earnings, I didn't think I was quite good enough to really make a go of it. So I think, what am I going to do? And I said, I got it. I'll go into management. It's got to be easy. Look at these idiots we had at Northrop.
Oh.
I mean, I was in one of 2 experimental research units. And to describe it is to say these were 2 departments of Sheldon's. I mean, everybody was either smart or scary smart, but we were all weird and socially backward.
Yeah.
And the managers were too. And they got so little out of us. So I decided to take some management courses, and there were only a few courses at MIT that didn't have prerequisites, because at this point I'm in my junior year, finishing my junior year. And one of them was described in an intro by this young professor who was finishing his PhD, actually hadn't finished it at that moment, called organizational psychology. And his name was David Kolb, who most people know from experiential learning fame.
Kolb,
I mean, I was there in his office when, that's right, Kolb and McIntyre. When they created that first book. I was there when he created in his office experiential learning theory.
Wow.
And the subject of the course sounded to me like utter bullshit crap. I mean, it was organizational psychology.
Yeah.
But he said 2 words in his description that made me run to the basement to get into his class because everything was oversubscribed. And the 2 words were no tests. So I'd like to point out that the major twists in our life path sometimes are affected by things that don't make sense. Anyway, it was during that course that I wanted to do a paper on how managers didn't help their subordinates. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, I've got some real data on how their version of the MBA, 28 to 30-year-olds, were helping each other or not, that they'd been collecting every week over several semesters. So I said, sure, I'd love to actually work with real data. He loved what I did, even though I was new to this whole field of working with words. And social science statistics to me were like baby arithmetic compared to the kind of stuff that I was used to. Yeah. But nonetheless, I slogged through it. He offered me a job for the summer. We ended up publishing the paper. And in the process, Dave got me into PhD seminars with Ed Schein, who became one of my mentors.
Yes.
And Dave McClellan, who became my thesis advisor at Harvard. And, I also studied with Carl Swanson and Jack Pugh, who were in the Forrester's Systems Dynamics group. Mm-hmm. So it was a phenomenal thing. And they are the ones who convinced me to go for a doctorate, go into psychology. And They helped me get into Harvard. So, but the very first study was on helping, but it was helping around behavior change. And in the spring of 67, Dave Kolb and I laid out the first versions of what I've spent my life studying, which is I now call intentional change theory.
What a story, Richard. Here's my my take so far. Each of those people, Dave Kolb and each of the others you've named, all saw something in you. And here's my guess. They saw limitless interest and curiosity and intellect. They didn't feel they were going to bump up against aspects of your outlook that would waste their time. And so you were able to move pretty much freely from MIT numbers on blackboards back then and equations to, I think, penetrating discussions about why people refuse to change or do.
Yeah.
So I think they saw, and I'm, when we first started talking today, all the different areas that your books are reaching, all the different twists, good twists in regard to what you're going to look at next. Where all of that, I think they saw in you back then. Do you want to dispute that?
Thank you. I've heard from them each of them over the years, and for many of them before they died, that yes, it was something like that. They saw a huge curiosity.
Yes.
They saw a relentless desire to work. And even though I had not been in a verbal field, I mean, Einstein's first feedback to me, on the first paper I did for his PhD seminar, was amazing because he asked me to come into his office because he couldn't understand the sentences I'd written. I wasn't used to writing in sentences. And I think part of it was I was an oddity. And actually, the folks at Department of Social Relations at Harvard said, yeah, we're interested in you. They were interested in me, but not so much to give me money. But they said, I said, hey, you let me in, I'll find the money. So I put myself through that program too. But the point, I think, was that when I was in interpersonal settings, I could usually carry my own. And people didn't know that I wasn't a PhD student as long as I wore my tie and sport coat, which is what we wore in those days to graduate seminars, even though I hadn't been in the field before. And I think part of it's the whole kind of child of immigrants is I was ready to just work my rear end off. And I was socially not quite up to my age. So I think I was nerdy enough that I really dove into things and worked at it. But I've always suspected it was all of that plus, and this is what I really got refined at MIT. If I don't worry about the isms and social identities, I'm really a social engineer. I study things that don't seem right or need to be better or need to be fixed. Mm-hmm. And the whole first 10 years of my work as a psychologist, I was working on competencies, but the main activity was doing therapy with alcoholics and drug addicts and doing basic research on the effect of alcohol on males and trying to figure out why it got some males to get into fights and show aggression and a bunch of things like that. But the puzzle was always, how do people change?
Yeah.
And interesting, my theory is the only that I know of fractal theory. Because in fact, in the book I'm writing now, trying to encapsulate my 56 years of research on this, I'm trying to explain how intentional change theory explains sustained desired change for individuals, dyads, teams, organizations, communities, and countries. And I mean, even in my doctoral exams, I did it on individual change and unconscious drives and personality, and on organizational change. Yeah. So it's always fascinated me, not only how do individuals change themselves, but the systems that we're a part of. And it's that systems perspective that, I mean, I really owe to all of my training and mindset that I learned at MIT. Yeah. I mean, it was clear to me, even when I was doing therapy and training therapists to work with alcoholics, that if you didn't help people fix their or rebuild their family system or their work system, they were going to be back drinking or using within months.
Within months, it's very much
systems.
So. Yeah.
And today, one of the study groups I just started 3 years ago was, because I'd ended my intentional change study group, I'd ended the coaching study group, and I had a whole bunch of doctoral students and some former doctoral students who are now faculty who wanted to study peer coaching in groups. And it's an area that has had very little empirical research, even though it's been around since time immemorial.
Yeah.
And again, inspired by things like Alcoholics Anonymous. But the idea is fundamentally that while everybody wants to be developed, and in fact, it's perhaps the major drive that people have these days in terms of work, that training doesn't have much of a lasting effect because of the honeymoon effect. 3 weeks to 3 months and you're back the way you were. Formal education doesn't have much sticking power in terms of competencies.
No.
Developmental assignments can work, but they're horribly wasteful. So coaching has become very, very popular.
Yeah.
And the practice has exceeded the research to say we know what we're doing. Well, even if the coaching is working, one-on-one coaching is very costly and labor intensive, and it becomes very elitist. So how do we democratize coaching? How do we offer coaching to the millions of people in organizations that don't have an assigned coach from HR because they're not executives? Or how do we reach the billions of people who aren't even in organizations with more than 50 people around the world? That's where I think understanding the dynamics of peer coaching in groups and making it helpful, not just, complaining bitch sessions, could hold the promise for a whole new wave of development.
Oh, I love it. I love the feel of it. I love your enthusiasm for it. And I grew up in a rural state, Maine. And in around the same time as you did, 40s, 50s schooling. But it struck me as I was listening and I was kind of feeling what you were saying about peer coaching, is that that just happened as a matter of fact.
There's a sense of community. Where in Maine did you grow up?
In Portland.
Oh, it was a big city.
Big, well, yeah, but it was a small town, and the thing is that here's the key to it. It was listening. Now, maybe I'm imposing this on a whole generation, but I have a feeling that what we did better back then, because we had so few distractions. We had a little bit of radio noise in the background, and you'd go to a movie, but you'd have to walk down the street to get to it. So in the meantime, what did you have? You had conversation, and it was fun because you would say, "Well, how you doing?" That was the way it started. Oh, Jesus, I'll tell you, I had a rough night. Oh, you've been drinking? Yeah. And so we were peers. And we listened to each other.
Right. No, I think.
And it was an egalitarian kind of state back then, because there were very few people of great wealth, very few. And we didn't know poor because from time to time, my parents would, not have enough to pay, this bill. So they'd pay that one, all of that. So we just had an environment where we could accept the responsibility of listening to each other. So
you experienced and you discovered what every community,
mm-hmm.
and in particular rural or semi-rural communities have, which is each other.
Yeah.
And whether the organizing vehicle is a local church, or in some countries a temple or mosque,
mm-hmm.
or it is just people reaching out to each other. I mean, I used to do a lot of the therapy in Vermont, in northern Vermont, as well as other places. And my wife and I have always spent a lot of time vacationing and sailing out of Acadia and Southwest Harbor and all the way up and down the coast of Maine.
Yeah.
And boy, you get, I mean, if you think about Portland when you were growing up, then you think about East Craftsbury, an hour drive on a dry day north of Montpelier in Vermont, or, going up to Orono and then heading out for an hour northeast.
You're in.
Yeah. I mean, what do you have except other people? So
exactly.
One, you learned to build relationships and keep them. And a part of that was listening. You're right. But the relationships were the key. I would also contend that because you didn't have access to a lot of external stimulation like the internet or podcasts,
mm-hmm.
you spent more time daydreaming.
Oh, yeah.
And thinking. And as a result, I think it garners a different level of self-discipline, of creativity.
It does. And I would throw into the stew here about importance of getting to know each other and keeping those relationships, stories. Yeah. And I suspect that I'm sure that's crossed your pages many times. But the other thing that kept us going in a way was our given the time to use our imaginations, was the good old Maine tall tale.
Yep.
To learn how to take something that others would look at as ordinary and say, well, to you it's a turtle. But let me tell you about that turtle, and I was raised on that, and it infused my teaching and my writing ever since. That what the story would do, though, is it would draw people in, and then if they became part of your story, and we became part of their story, like now I'm the story of Farmington, Maine, which is where I was a dean. Public service for a number of years. That's sort of helped us through the rough times too.
Well, and the key to the stories that they invoke emotions.
Yes.
And it's one of the mistakes we make these days and I think Descartes really did us a disservice by pushing us to thinking that the analytic part of the human brain and spirit was the key. In fact, I think it was a combination of the analytic and the emotional. But you're right. Stories are the way we talk to each other. I mean, and of course, for Maine, there was the Bert and I loved motor cars, any color, as long as they're black.
Which way to win a Pidlock? Yeah, that guy got a nice buck out of that whole thing. And I said, why is he making money at it when this is what we do just to get through the day? Right. It was unfair, but it was good. And I understand. And I think you and I both have sensed what the value of being in small town and being, northern Vermont, where my daughter lives in Stowe, and the kids were raised in Farmington, which was Western Maine, on the same line as.
Oh yeah, I know. One of my good friends' oldest grandson, just graduated there 2 years ago.
Oh, nice. Well, I worked at that school, so I think that the neat thing about this conversation, Richard, is while you're working on what I think will be a fantastic book, where you're trying to bring the fractals together about intentional change, we both light up with our own personal experiences. And to me, and let me just jump real quickly to the big boogie man and woman, person, whatever in the room. It's not even a person. It's that chatbot thing and the artificial intelligence. And so while it can assemble a paper or you name it, it'll look very much like it was written by a human. It doesn't have that in it. What is it missing? It's missing what you and I call the common touch, our own, putting our own feelings into it. It's absolutely without feeling, without soul, nothing. It's vapid.
I did my PhD thesis on unconscious intimacy drives.
Wow.
David McClellan. I created a new theory of affiliation motivation. Growing up in a Greek culture, I saw relationships and friendships and intimacy differently than a lot of my American friends did. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that happened, actually, it was because of a historical radio show that I was asked the year after I finished my thesis. So it was 1974. I was asked to do a radio discussion group in Burlington, Vermont.
There you go.
And I ended up doing it there. And then somebody from Boston picked it up. I did it again in Cambridge. And I called the talk, The Destruction of Intimacy in America. This is 1974, but I felt that we had stopped sitting around talking after dinner. We didn't have the traditional European passeggiata where after dinner you'd go for a walk in the community and talk to people sitting on their steps. And I blamed 1974. I blamed TV and box games for creating that distance. Now this was before the internet, before iPhones, way before Facebook and social media. But I would say psychologically, we know from the research that's published every month that the more people rely on social media, email, texting, all that, the more they suffer from chronic anxiety and even depression. And we see this we saw it starting and ramping up pre-COVID, but COVID made it worse because of all the social isolation.
That's right.
So the net result is that these electronic aided things create the illusion of more social interaction, when in fact, they're missing the depth and quality and consistency of interacting with the same people over time.
Yeah. Consistency is the key. Consistency, and we also have this remember the book, The Temporary Society was written back when I was in college and all of that. And I remember reading it and I was a sociology major at Colby College. And I remember them saying, I grew up in permanence, and a temporary society was all. Now we have the gig economy. Now we have people who, because of the pandemic, are walking away from their jobs because it's so.
So let's be careful because it's so easy for, you said you're 80, I'm 76. It's so easy for us to be old fogies and say, well, the world is going to hell in a handbasket these days.
God damn it.
Although I do like the songs of Lady Gaga and Taylor Swift, so I don't know about the music critique, but one of the points I made in this talk was that the real threat to our social fabric was not the dramatically increasing divorce rate, was not the breakup of the nuclear family. It was the breakup of the extended family. It was as people moved away from their aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents, we lost these connections that went multi-generations. That even though sometimes it would get a bit incestuous in terms of the, everybody knows your business, but you always knew people you could count on.
That's right.
And there was, even though some of them were stern and strict and not nice, there were always some of them that were. So I think that back then was pretty bad. Now we know it's even worse, especially in North American society, including Canadian, because we don't tend to live near our extended families.
No. I will, throw out an impossibly complicated question to answer and even to ask here in our last few minutes. And it means I'm working for a sequel already for our conversation, Richard. But the question is, all right, knowing what we have just said, how atomized life in at least the Western world is right now, what can be done to turn that around and put people back together again?
Dave, it is one of the most simple answers. It's a complex question, but the answer is simple. Talk to people. But it's not just talk to people, care about them. In the last chapter in our last book, Helping People Change, we talked about the techniques of coaching with compassion, of whether you're a parent or a manager, not just formal coaching, but helping people, this technique that we all through compassion, not through compliance. And I wanted to tackle something in the last chapter. And the first draft of it, I titled it, Get Over Yourself. And my co-authors, Melvin Smith and Ellen Van Osten, said, no, that's much too negative. The whole book is very positive. And the editor at Harvard Business Review Press said the same thing. But here's the point that we began with. So our society, and actually this can apply to every society. I've been in 8 countries in the last year and a half, and in different continents, and we're all very similar. We've become rampant narcissists, all of us. And if you ever doubt it, when did the selfie become the most popular form of photography? So what's the antidote? Well, it turns out the antidote, and we know this from our own fMRI neurological studies, the antidote is to be in caring conversations with people. And it doesn't mean you have to become a social worker, but you have to care. You have to care whether they're in pain or they want to grow. And as you said at the beginning, that always involves listening because it's focused on them, not you. Yeah. And other people don't exist to be instruments of your self-exploration. So what we thought is, if everybody tried to have 2 or 3 10 to 15 minute conversations each week in which you ask the other person about their dreams, about their values, about who helped them, about what they're looking forward to, about, even as playful as what would you do with 80 million after tax if you won it in the lottery, that if we have those conversations, even in 15-minute doses, we spark, in my theory and the physiology, part of the parasympathetic nervous system, because we're activating a neural network called technically the default mode network. And one of the key parts of the brain that we stimulate in this, and we showed it in one of our studies, is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, this thing back here that is the key crosswalk that Naomi Eisenberger and other neuroscientists have shown is the network in the brain that's set off when you're interacting with other people.
Yep.
And when you're interacting with them, in which you're actually paying attention to them and their emotions, it sets off the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the only antidote to stress, which is the place in your body's hormonal system in which you're open to others and new ideas. So if we each did that, again, short doses, we don't have to sit down or lie down on a couch. This is stuff over lunch or drinks or coffee breaks.
Mm-hmm.
And we encourage other people to have those conversations. Can you imagine how we would create an antidote to the feelings of fear and isolation? I mean, that's what narcissism is. It's a defensive posture.
Yeah.
You're asserting yourself because you feel that either you're worthless or nobody else cares about you. So if we encourage people to do that, to go back to the kind of conversations you were talking about, walking on the street on the way to a movie in Portland or Farmington or any place.
Yep.
That ends up being, because what you said when you talked about that conversation, you said, one person said, well, how are you doing?
Yep.
And the other person answered them honestly. That was a caring conversation.
It was. And I'm delighted to know that with all of your wonderful thought and research over all these years, and with the people with whom you've worked, that you've come to answer my final question of the conversation today with care for each other.
Right.
It's like, as you said, it's a simple answer to a complicated thing. And I'm going to second the motion and make sure when I post this podcast that I do my little bit of preaching about it, because I know it works. Yeah. I know it works. I believe it to my core.
John Lennon was right.
John was he knew how to get to us, and in many ways he was right, and I think, let me add this codicil, that people who write music these days with a caring nature and want their message to come out through their music, very helpful to us. I saw a little excerpt of an interview with Willie Nelson, who is one of my heroes because he's my age and he's still performing. And he said, I've been everywhere and met hundreds of thousands of people. And he said, basically, people are a lot alike. This is Willie. And he said, my music draws them in, so I get to meet them. But when I ask them, what is it about my song or my music? They say, you're just singing to me, Willie. You're making me feel like I belong. And I see one guy with a beat up old guitar. Granted, he's got a bit of an infrastructure to support him. But I used his book in my last course that I taught before I retired in 2016 for my innovation class. I said, read this book. And I want to point out one particular paragraph in this whole book about this very successful human being who's lived a lot of different ups and downs. They ask him, when the IRS takes away all your wealth and they have, and your farms and your cars and everything else. And Willie said, well, I still have my guitar and I can still make up songs. And that was my point to my students. Whatever you get through, be sure you don't give up the one or two things that you can do no matter what.
Right.
And you're a wonderful, distinguished professor and a wonderful,
thank you.
Wonderful
Must
person.
Have been a great course, Dave.
I think it was. Thank you very much, Richard. Let's I want a sequel.
Hey, if Rocky could go 6 movies, we could certainly do 2 or 3.
I don't know about those stairs, though, Richard.
Yeah, right.
Thank you again.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for listening to the Practice Podcast, where we discuss practice with a capital P. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to inactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to inactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Oh, how could I have forgotten? Our digital book on practice as a way of being is now available. You'll find it online at www.mylibrary.world. I worked on that book after Peter passed away, and I think you will find it a unique and very, very mobile reading experience, since it's wherever your screen is in hand or at hand.